now we're buying oil from Venezuela. Can you believe it? We have more liquid gold under our feet than any other nation, but we're buying tar.
The global energy landscape is a complex web of interconnected players, from China and the US to Europe, Canada, Mexico, and Venezuela. Venezuela's resurgence, America's surprising moves, Canada's anxieties, and the subtle calculations of international politics are all converging. The US once relied heavily on Canada's oil sands. However, geopolitical shifts, climate concerns, and high production costs have begun to alter this dynamic. Now, the US is looking again at Venezuela's vast oil reserves, a move made even more intriguing by tariff tensions with Canada, the international controversy surrounding the Maduro administration, and some stunning diplomatic maneuvers. But how did the US become interested in Venezuela, a country plagued by political and economic crises, instead of Canada, a long-time and reliable oil partner? This question puzzles international analysts and excites global energy markets. In recent months, Chevron has rapidly increased its activities in Venezuela, significantly boosting the country's oil production. Venezuela, which once produced 3 million barrels a day but fell below 1 million due to sanctions, mismanagement, and economic collapse, is now on the rise again. Chevron's hand was freed somewhat when the US eased its harsh stance towards Maduro on certain issues. This has fueled market speculation that Venezuela is making a big comeback. Meanwhile, Canada has expressed its anger, questioning whether the US will impose tariffs on Canadian oil only to then turn around and buy from Venezuela. This situation is intertwined with US tariffs. Canada has long been the largest supplier of crude oil to the US. The rich oil sands in Alberta pump millions of barrels of crude oil south to US refineries every day. While this oil may not be the highest quality, its geological proximity, political stability, and existing infrastructure have made it a valuable resource for years. However, the US trade strategy, with its America First approach, has taken some unexpected turns. The tariff showdown with Canada has angered Ottawa. The US has begun to wonder, if high tariffs are implemented, Canadian oil will become expensive. So how can we find affordable heavy crude for our refineries? The answer, surprisingly, may be Venezuela. The same quality of heavy crude once made Venezuela a major supplier to US refineries. This is where the sanctions and political disputes that have crippled Venezuela for decades come into play. With Nicolas Maduro in power, Venezuela is a country where the economic crisis has reached devastating proportions. The US once recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido and declared the Maduro regime illegitimate. But time passes, and world realities change. Now, the US seems to be seeking a reconciliation with Maduro. US special envoys have repeatedly traveled to Caracas, and there have even been meetings in Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, Chevron's exemption from sanctions, or at least its limited liberalization, is boosting Venezuelan production again. The country, which used to produce 3 million barrels, had fallen below 1 million and is now exceeding that mark again. Is this the awakening of a giant? In the oil market, Venezuela's crude is categorized as heavy and high in sulfur, similar to Canada's. Refineries around the Gulf of Mexico are specifically designed for this heavy crude. This heavy crude, whether it comes from Canada or Venezuela, is the main input for these refineries. If a tariff war with Canada erupts, or if production costs skyrocket, tankers from Venezuela could be a lifeline. This was, in fact, the case many years ago, but the diplomatic crisis with Maduro put it on hold. Now, a new era seems to be beginning. The risks in the energy trade are significant. Canada supplies about 20% of US oil consumption and 60% of imported crude oil. Many US refineries are specifically configured for the heavier grades of crude produced by Canada and Venezuela, rather than the lighter grades coming from US shale fields. How has Venezuela increased its oil production? Oil remains critical to Venezuela's economy, accounting for around 87% of its export revenue. The government set a strategic goal of exceeding 1 million barrels per day after years of sharp declines. Chevron's involvement has been a key factor in this increase. This rise is taking place despite Venezuela's struggling refineries, neglected drilling rigs, and shortage of spare parts. The U.S. administration had previously declared the Maduro regime a failure. So, what has changed? Perhaps the migration issue, geopolitical calculations, and pressure from domestic lobbies are pushing the U.S. in this direction. The Venezuelan move is not just an oil issue, it's a geopolitical chess move. It also looks like a plan B for the confrontation with Canada. The tariffs are pushing the U.S. to consider alternatives. On the Canadian side, there is a strong reaction. The foreign minister has warned the U.S. that they have no choice but to rely on Canada, arguing that abandoning Canada means dependence on risky suppliers like Venezuela. U.S. refineries are still heavily dependent on Canadian supplies, but some argue that no one is indispensable. If the tariffs kick in, what will Ottawa do? Will they come to the table and accept the conditions? Some experts believe the U.S. is taking a risk. Venezuela is an unstable resource. Sanctions may be on the agenda again. Is rapprochement with Maduro sustainable in the long run? The reality is that global demand for fossil fuels remains high, and the U.S. wants stable prices. From time to time, strategic assessments are made that Venezuela could be an advantage over OPEC and Russia. Moreover, the U.S. likes to diversify its oil imports to balance the market. The reflections of these developments in Latin America are also interesting. Countries like Colombia, Brazil, and Ecuador want to increase their oil exports. China is giving huge loans to the Maduro administration. Russia was providing technical support. Now, with U.S. involvement, the geopolitics of the region are stirring. The U.S. must consider the interests of Gulf of Mexico refineries. Mexico is also an important exporter of oil to the U.S., and they also produce heavy crude. A pure economic calculation, Canada, Mexico, and Venezuela, which one can offer a better deal, combined with big politics creates a complex picture. Chevron's success on the ground has fueled the debate. Is the U.S. winking at Maduro? While there are statements about a golden age in Latin America and redemocratization, Maduro remains in power. The opposition is weak and elections are questionable. It is not easy to do business with Venezuela. Production is increasing but still low. Infrastructure is crumbling. Political risk is high. In the long run, it is impossible to completely abandon Canada. But in the short to medium term, this card could be used to put pressure on Canada. If you do not accept the tariffs, I will buy from Venezuela. How will all this affect oil prices? If supply increases, prices may fall. But if Venezuela really stabilizes, its market share will increase. China is also interested in Venezuela. Maybe competition will escalate. It is a complicated picture. There is also the question of U.S. public opinion. Is it right to get closer to Venezuela? Opponents cite human rights violations and economic collapse. Supporters argue there are geostrategic realities. We need crude oil. We need to cover this deficit without Russia. If we win Venezuela, we control the Western Hemisphere. While there are different voices, Chevron's actions show the practical direction. Corporations are profit-oriented, and when politics flexes, they increase investment. In conclusion, is the U.S. choosing Venezuelan oil over Canadian oil? It's provocative, but there is truth in it. We cannot easily say yes, but there are signals. If Canadian supplies become more expensive because of tariffs, U.S. refiners may turn to Venezuela. Chevron is leading the way. The Maduro regime would not want to miss this opportunity. A revival in U.S.-Venezuelan oil trade is likely in the near term. But what happens long term? What if the U.S. tightens sanctions again? There are no certainties in Venezuela policy. However, the fact that Maduro and the U.S. have been engaging in dialogues strengthens the idea that they have shared interests and can find a compromise. Would Canada be the loser? Perhaps it will have to negotiate with the U.S. and make concessions. The U.S. ultimately wants energy security. Neither Venezuela nor Canada can be trusted infinitely, but trade and diplomacy are interest-driven. The U.S., which has already increased its own oil production, still needs heavy crude. Therefore, it is either tied to Canada or will turn to alternatives like Venezuela. In this geostrategic competition, diplomacy and energy policy are intertwined. Maybe tomorrow everything will change. What is clear is that developments like Chevron's activities, Venezuela's production increase, and the U.S.'s less strict stance toward Maduro strengthen the possibility that the U.S. may embrace Venezuelan oil again. Canada worries. Our task is to watch these chess moves closely. When actors like China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia enter the picture, it becomes even more complex. The energy market shows that no major decision can be taken without politics. Is rapprochement with Venezuela a smart move, or is it a temporary trump card? Where do Canada's reaction, tariffs, and Chevron's initiatives fit? Share your comments.